I woke up that morning to the usual stir of my neighborhood. Garbage trucks rumbling down the street, a stray dog barking in the distance, and a faint whistle of a train that always seemed to pass by around 6. My name is Tom, and I'm 64 years old. Up until recently, I considered myself an ordinary man, semi-retired financial consultant, longtime husband to my wife, Lynn, and father to a son who now lives halfway across the country. We have our little corner house in suburban Portland. Quiet place, a rosebush by the front window that Lynn always used to trim every spring. Back when she could. I stood at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee into my favorite mug, an old chipped souvenir from a trip to Cannon Beach. I sniffed the aroma as I watched the dawn break outside. The sky was a dusty pink, streaked with gold. There was a gentle hum from the refrigerator, and the flicker of a bulb in the old overhead lamp that sometimes buzzed when the voltage got wacky. The scent of fresh grounds calmed my nerves, or tried to. In that moment, my thoughts circled around Lynn and her condition. She'd been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer a year ago. I was there when the oncologist, Dr. Anthony Carter, delivered the news. That day, my world cracked. But I found strength I didn't know I had. I held her hand through every chemo session, stocked the fridge with her favorite fruit yogurts, washed her soiled sheets on nights the treatment made her too weak or nauseated to move, and I did it all out of love. Out of old-fashioned, bone-deep loyalty. I remember how her hair started falling out in clumps, how she'd look at me with those weary green eyes, half apologetic, half terrified. I swore, silently, I wouldn't crumble. "We'll get through this," I said, more times than I could count. But it was wearing me down, more than I liked to admit. Last night, she'd barely spoken to me. She lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, and gave short answers to every question I asked. I chalked it up to exhaustion, or maybe depression. Cancer does that, I told myself. The coffee tasted bitter that morning. Not because I'd overbrewed it, because inside me something felt off, a weird ache that went deeper than the usual worry. I set my mug down, rubbed my temples, and tried to push away the creeping sense of dread. Then my phone buzzed. An unknown number. Out of habit, I answered. "Tom." A voice, low and shaky. I recognized it. Harriet, a friend of Lynn's from her old school. She was the artsy type, always wearing bright scarves. "Tom, I'm sorry if I'm stepping out of line." I felt my pulse jump. "It's okay, Harriet. What's going on?" She hesitated. I heard the crackle of the line. "I saw Lynn last night. Near the hospital. She was not alone." My hand tightened around the phone. She had a doctor's appointment. Maybe Dr. Carter was. "It wasn't him I saw," Harriet said softly. "Look, I might be wrong, but it just seemed off. I'll let you figure it out." "Sorry, Tom." I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, even after the call ended. My heart hammered, and I felt a chill run across my arms. Harriet's words made no sense to me. Lynn had promised me she'd be home early. She hadn't come in till after 10. I was half asleep when she slipped under the covers, smelling of something not quite right, some faint cologne that I didn't recognize. I told myself to ignore it because I was too tired to deal with paranoid thoughts. Now it all rushed back like an icy wave. The beep of the coffee machine brought me back to reality. I slammed the phone onto the counter and closed my eyes, forcing a slow breath. Could Harriet be mistaken? Lynn was sick, for God's sake. She needed comfort, not clandestine adventures. My gut churned. I glanced at the clock. 7:15 a.m. I had a busy morning, and Lynn was still upstairs sleeping. Or so I assumed. I tiptoed to our bedroom. The door was ajar. She lay on the bed, hair in disarray, the covers pulled halfway up. I stood there, observing the rise and fall of her chest, that shallow breath. Even in her weakened state, she radiated a certain delicate beauty. Her pale cheeks, those freckles that had once enchanted me. Could she? The thought was so jarring I almost laughed at its absurdity. But memory is an unkind friend. It replayed the times she'd been oddly distant, the moments she stared at her phone with an intensity that shut me out, the late-night walks she insisted helped her anxiety, and the hesitation in her voice whenever I tried to plan something. She claimed exhaustion. I believed her. I stepped back, trying not to wake her. That day, I had to drive her to a chemo session at noon. Maybe I'd find a chance to talk, but I felt too numb, too ashamed, too frightened. Instead, I decided to get on with routine. Gather the mail from the porch, check the monthly bills, distract myself with anything but Harriet's ominous suggestion. At around 9:30, while sorting through a stack of old letters, I came across an envelope with no return address. I thought it was a piece of junk mail. Inside, however, I found several printed photos. The first shot nearly knocked the wind out of me. Lynn, in a hospital corridor, leaning against Dr. Carter's shoulder. It didn't look inappropriate, just friendly. The second photo was unmistakable. Lynn was perched on the passenger seat of a dark sedan, leaning in to kiss him. Their faces partly in shadow, but her hair was recognizable, and so was the outline of his jaw. My hand trembled. I flipped through the rest. The images were grainy but undeniably intimate. Them walking hand in hand on a late-night street, her clutching his arm in a way that was far from professional doctor-patient courtesy. My vision blurred. I clutched the back of the dining chair, trying to breathe. The hush of the suburban morning pressed in. I heard a neighbor's lawnmower start up outside. Normal life. Normal day. Everything had just changed, though. My wife was having an affair with her oncologist, Dr. Carter, a man nearly 20 years younger than her, a man I had entrusted with her care. I wanted to scream, but my voice refused to rise. I crumpled the photos in my fist, then realized I might need them as evidence, so I smoothed them out, hands shaking. My mind reeled through 1,000 questions. Why? How long? Did anyone else know? Then the bedroom door creaked, and I heard Lynn's soft footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in the hallway, wrapped in a light gray robe. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. "Tom, you okay?" she asked, noticing me leaning on the chair, my knuckles white. "You look ill." "Me? Ill?" I forced a bitter chuckle. The words stuck in my throat. I could see her gaze shift to the photos on the table, her expression flicker. Fear, guilt, something else. She didn't speak. I felt anger swirl in my gut. I clenched my jaw. What the hell is this? Lynn. She approached slowly, lips parted as though she might conjure a quick lie. But maybe she realized there was no easy exit. "Tom, it's not what it looks like." Her voice trembled. "Then what is it?" I hissed, holding up one of the photos. The image captured her leaning in for a kiss in a parked car. "Because to me, it looks like you and Carter are." "He's helping me," she blurted. I was so desperate. The chemo, the fear, the sense that I'm dying inside. We formed this connection. I never meant for it to go so far. I stared at her, unable to form a coherent response. My mind burned with the image of them together. My wife, my Lynn, the woman I'd held when she shivered, the one I'd spent nights praying for. And Dr. Carter, with his professional smile, those reassuring words about her treatment. I felt bile rising in my throat. "How long?" I managed to force out. Her eyes flickered. "A few months." After my second round of chemo, I slammed my palm on the table. The photos rattled. "A few months. While I've been here, cleaning up vomit, cooking your dinner, picking up your meds." She flinched. The shock in her eyes told me she hadn't expected this confrontation so soon. Maybe she thought she'd be more prepared, or maybe she assumed I'd never find out. "It was never about you not being enough," she whispered. With him, I felt alive, like I wasn't just a dying patient or a tired old wife. Heat surged through my chest. "So you betray our 41 years, because you need to feel alive." Damn it. Lynn. My voice broke on her name. All the suppressed emotion tore through me. Rage, sorrow, betrayal. You're dying. And you decide your final act is to, what? Cheat on me with your doctor. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she still reached out, as if to touch my hand. I yanked it away. I'm sorry, she murmured. I never planned. That's enough, I cut her off. We're going to talk about this after your chemo session. Get dressed. We'll leave in an hour. Then, with a trembling voice I barely recognized as my own, I added, or you can call your lover to drive you. She gazed at me, stricken, then turned away, shoulders shaking. I watched her climb the stairs, her steps heavier than ever. Part of me wanted to chase after her, wrap her in my arms, and tell her we'd find a way. But a darker part, there would be time for tears later, maybe never. Right now, I needed to hold it together, if only so I could confront Dr. Carter face to face, because Harriet had only hinted, but these pictures shouted the truth. My wife was physically involved with that man. An hour later, Lynn came downstairs dressed in simple black slacks and a loose sweater. She'd brushed her short hair, but her face was pale, eyes red-rimmed. Neither of us said a word when we got into my old sit-in. The engine sputtered to life, and I pulled away from the curb. The drive to the hospital was tense, punctuated by the hum of the AC. She looked out the window, hands clasped in her lap. My mind raced with images, her hand on Dr. Carter's chest, her lips parted in a moan, his hands on her. Stop. Stop, I told myself. But it wouldn't stop. The scenario played like a loop, fueling my bitterness. The wheels shook beneath my grip. We reached the hospital. I parked, got out without a word, and opened the passenger side door for her. The old courtesy. She stepped out slowly, wincing at a jolt of pain in her hip. I didn't offer my arm. She glanced at me briefly, then walked ahead. Inside, the hallways buzzed with staff and patients, the fluorescent lights harsh on my eyes. The smell of antiseptic and that hospital dryness. My heart pounded. I told myself I had to keep calm, but a voice in my head whispered, this man took advantage of her vulnerability. Or maybe she let him. Or maybe they both were at fault. I didn't know what to believe. We approached the oncology ward. And there he was, standing by a nurse's station, flipping through a chart. Dr. Anthony Carter, with his neatly trimmed hair and confident posture. The man I'd once thanked for helping Lynn battle her disease. He looked up, caught sight of her, then me. For a moment, something flickered across his face, guilt, or maybe mild panic. He set the chart down. Lynn, he said with professional warmth, nodding at me. Tom. I felt my hand clench. I had to forcibly remind myself not to cause a scene in the middle of the hospital. Lynn lowered her head, refused to meet his eyes. A nurse came by with a concerned glance. Dr. Carter cleared his throat. We're running slightly behind schedule today. Why don't you have a seat in the waiting area for a few minutes? I'll call you when we're ready. Lynn mumbled a thank you. I stood there, rigid, glaring at him. He avoided direct eye contact with me and vanished into an exam room. I followed Lynn into the waiting area. Stark white walls, stiff chairs lined along them. A TV in the corner playing some morning talk show about local events. A few other patients and relatives sat around, flipping magazines, eyes heavy with quiet dread. My wife sank into a chair. I stood beside her, not wanting to sit. My mind was a jumble of accusations. I kept hearing Harriet's voice. She was not alone. I saw the crumpled photos in my head. I felt the sting of betrayal. For a moment, Lynn glanced up at me, eyes pleading. But I turned away. The nurse eventually called her name. I helped her up, a reflex from months of caretaking. She seemed surprised I bothered. In the next instant, Dr. Carter appeared to guide her into the treatment suite. The brief moment when their eyes met made my stomach lurch. I couldn't decide if it was love I saw there, or just pity, or raw guilt. I sank into the waiting room chair, my foot tapping an erratic rhythm on the tiled floor. I remembered the vow I made to confront him. But how? Storm in, cause a scene, scream at him. That might cost him his job. Maybe he deserved it. But Lynn, did she deserve the meltdown that would inevitably follow? The questions tore at me. Minutes felt like hours. Each passing second deepened the ache in my chest. The overhead TV droned on about a charity event for stray animals. I stared at the door, imagining the two of them alone. Maybe he'd whisper something soothing. Maybe she'd hold his hand. My fists tightened. A watery film coated my eyes, but I blinked it away. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened. A nurse poked her head out. "Mr. Baker," she asked softly, using my surname. "We're finished for now. Lynn's resting." I jumped up, ignoring the stiff ache in my knees. The nurse guided me to a small private room. There, Lynn sat in a recliner, an IV stand beside her. She looked drained, as always after chemo. Dr. Carter stood near her, scribbling in a chart. The nurse hovered in the corner. "How's she doing?" I asked, my tone clipped, civil enough to pass. Dr. Carter turned, his expression professional. "She responded well to today's infusion. We'll keep monitoring her." "Outside," I snapped, pointing to the corridor. "We need to talk." He glanced at Lynn, then at the nurse, who stayed silent but seemed uneasy. "Of course," he said calmly and stepped out. I followed, heart pounding. We ended up near a vending machine. The corridor was mostly empty. I took a breath, then said in a low, tense voice, "I know about you and Lynn." He didn't feign ignorance. He exhaled and nodded. "I figured you might, eventually. You took advantage of a sick woman." I hissed, my fists balled. "Did you think this would stay hidden? Did you think I was too old, too blind to see?" His jaw tensed. "Tom, this isn't the place." "Damn right it's not the place," I spat. "But you made it this way. She's my wife. We've been married over 4 decades. And you," my voice quivered with rage, "you're her physician." He took a step back, raking a hand through his hair. "I didn't plan for this to happen. She needed emotional support." I lost perspective. I never intended to hurt her or you. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "You're a doctor. You know better than anyone that a patient is vulnerable. This is unethical. It's monstrous." His face hardened. "Don't you dare call me monstrous. I've dedicated my life to helping cancer patients. Lynn, she's more than a patient. Our connection grew out of her despair, yes, but also out of genuine feeling." "Feeling?" I scoffed. My chest burned with adrenaline. "You'll destroy her life. She might not have long, and you choose to do this. Why? For a quick thrill? For excitement? Because you're bored with your own existence?" He clenched his jaw, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "It's not just excitement. I care about her. I know it's wrong. God, I know. But what's done is done." For a moment, my anger choked me. My vision blurred with unused tears. "You're damn right it's done. After this, I'm going to ensure you never touch her again. Mark my words." I whirled around before he could respond and stormed back into Lynn's room. Lynn stared at me, eyes wide. She must have heard the raised voices. I didn't speak. I just stood there, chest heaving, fury rolling off me in waves. She tried to say something, but all that came out was a weak whisper, "Tom." I said nothing. I was too enraged, too wounded to speak. The nurse excused herself quietly, leaving us alone in that sterile hospital room. The beep of medical monitors accompanied the roiling storm in my head. I clenched my fists, inhaling the antiseptic smell. In that moment, a line was crossed. Betrayal was no longer some vague suspicion, but a brutal, present reality. I knew from that second forward, my life, and Lynn's, would never be the same. I drove us home in silence. Lynn tried to reach for my hand a couple of times, but I kept both on the steering wheel, knuckles taut. Her gaze shifted to the window, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. Yet she didn't sob or protest. Maybe she had no words left. Maybe guilt weighed too heavily on her. At the house, the late afternoon sun cast diagonal shadows across the driveway. I parked and killed the engine. My heart still pounded with that same fierce anger, but a wave of exhaustion also washed over me. I unbuckled my seatbelt and said quietly, inside, "We need to talk." She nodded without a word. We shuffled up the front steps. The rosebush by the window had withered blossoms drooping on their stems, an apt metaphor for our marriage, I thought grimly. Once inside, I tossed my jacket onto the couch, turned to face her. She stood in the living room, her posture fragile, as though one sudden move might shatter her. I gestured at the sofa. "Sit," I said, voice thick. She obeyed. I stayed standing, arms crossed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension coiled in the air. Finally, she murmured, "I'm sorry." My laughter was harsh. "Sorry. That's all you can say. After months of sneaking around with him." She flinched at my tone. "I never wanted you to find out this way. I was going to end it." I shot back. "Or confess." "Spare me your excuses, Lynn." I could feel the bitterness rising like bile in my throat. Memories of our wedding day, the birth of our son, countless anniversaries, now overshadowed by betrayal. She stared at her hands, fingers twisting. I felt like I was dying. Every day, the chemo, the pain, it's like everything that made me a woman was stripped away. You were always so strong, so composed. With Anthony, I could be vulnerable. I could let myself feel something besides despair. That name, Anthony, rattled inside my head. Just the sound of it made my skin crawl. "So it's my fault?" I asked, voice trembling. "Because I was too supportive. Because I didn't let you see me break." She shook her head, tears escaping down her cheeks. "No, it's not your fault. I'm the one who crossed the line. But it wasn't just physical, though that happened too." She closed her eyes in shame. "It was emotional. I know you gave me everything you could, Tom. But I needed a different kind of release." My jaw clenched. Images flashed in my mind. Them locked in an embrace, her mouth on his, intimate whispers shared behind my back. I fought a wave of nausea. You talk about release, about feeling alive. Do you have any idea how this feels for me? Watching the woman I've loved for more than 40 years slip away, and then discover she's turned to another man for comfort. My voice cracked on the last word. She didn't reply, just sobbed softly. I realized she was too weak, physically and emotionally, to fight me on this. That fact both fueled my anger and triggered my pity. I paced the room, trying to steady my breathing, seeking an anchor in the swirling chaos of betrayal and heartbreak. At last I said, "I'm going upstairs to rest. I can't look at you right now." She opened her mouth, but no sound came. With a hollow stare, she nodded. I walked away, feeling her gaze on my back, like a weight that threatened to drag me under. Up in my bedroom, I found the photos where I'd stashed them in the desk drawer. I took them out again, laid them on the bed, damning evidence of her infidelity. Each image told a piece of a story I never asked to witness. Her hand on his shoulder. A stolen kiss in the hospital parking lot. Walking arm in arm at dusk. Anguish flooded me anew. I sank onto the mattress, head in my hands. My pulse hammered in my ears. I thought about how we'd once been the devoted couple, pictures of us traveling, celebrating, smiling, back when we believed in forever. Now, the fragments of my life felt meaningless. Anger twisted inside me. I wanted to break something, to lash out. Maybe it was time for me to do more than brood. That night, I barely slept. Lynn stayed in the guest room, drifting in and out of medication-induced slumber. Around 3 a.m, I rose from bed, a sharp idea searing through the haze of resentment. I could ruin Dr. Carter. Expose him for violating every ethical rule in the book. Make sure the hospital board knew about his affair with a vulnerable, terminally ill patient. They'd revoke his license. He'd lose everything. A vengeful satisfaction stirred within me. But what about Lynn? Did I want to punish her as well? Part of me did. Another part remembered she might not have long. A swirl of conflicting emotions wrestled inside. Love, rage, pity, heartbreak, vengeance. The next days crawled by in a tense, suffocating routine. Lynn retreated into silence. I functioned on autopilot, paying bills, fetching groceries, scheduling her next appointments. Our son, Brian, called a couple of times, but I barely picked up. I couldn't bear telling him. How would that conversation even go? Yes, your mother is dying, and she's cheating on me with her oncologist. My stomach clenched every time I considered it. Yet inside, my plan took shape. I began collecting evidence. The photos, text messages. I snooped in her phone one desperate night, discovering a string of affectionate exchanges with Carter and medical ethics guidelines that clearly spelled out how doctor-patient relationships outside a professional context were prohibited. My mind churned with the idea of revenge. One afternoon, while Lynn dozed, I slipped out of the house and drove to Dr. Carter's neighborhood. It was a modest but well-kept area near the hospital. I parked a block away, an uneasy tremor in my hands. If he saw me, I wasn't sure I'd keep control, but I wanted to see the place. Maybe I hoped to catch them together again. The memory of Harriet's phone call gnawed at me. I waited there for over an hour, watching his driveway, feeling a sick sense of shame at my own voyeurism. Eventually, I saw him pull up in a dark sit-in. My chest tightened as he stepped out, phone to his ear, looking casual in jeans and a jacket. He paused, scanned the street. For a second, his gaze flickered over my car. I slunk lower in the seat, my heart hammered. Then he continued inside, door closing behind him. My breath came out shaky. This was madness, but I couldn't turn away from it. When I got home, Lynn was awake, sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea in her hands. She looked up, her cheeks drawn, her eyes shadowed. "Where did you go?" she asked softly. "Out," I replied, my tone clipped. "Needed air." She studied me, hesitating, then nodded. "We should talk about what happens now." "Nothing to talk about," I muttered. "We exist in the same house until I figure out the next step." She swallowed. "I understand you're furious. I deserve it. But I also need you to know I never wanted to hurt you." My throat tightened with conflicting emotions. "You did hurt me, Lynn," I said quietly, trembling with suppressed anger. "And the worst part is, you didn't even give me a chance to be what you needed." She lowered her gaze to the teacup. Silence stretched between us until I turned and walked away. The walls of our home felt oppressive, each room tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. Days blurred into each other, a blur of tension, short conversations, and sleepless nights. Through it all, I nurtured my plan for retribution. Why should that man, who preyed on my wife's frailty, be allowed to continue his career unscathed? My sense of justice roared to life, fueling my every waking moment. Lynn had another chemo session scheduled, and I intended to confront Dr. Carter again. But fate intervened. The night before the appointment, Lynn suffered a bout of severe nausea and collapsed in the bathroom. I rushed in, found her hunched over, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. Instinct took over. I knelt beside her, held her hair back, whispered assurances. For a brief instant, we were back to husband and wife, a caretaker and patient, entwined in mutual concern. By the time I helped her back to bed, my anger had waned, overshadowed by raw concern for her life. She clutched my arm, eyes brimming with fear. "Tom, I'm so afraid," she whispered. My resolve to punish them both wavered. She was still my wife, the woman I'd vowed to love in sickness and health, no matter how bitter the current circumstances. That night, I didn't leave her side, dozing lightly in a chair by her bed. When morning came, We postponed the chemo session so she could recover. Yet the taste for revenge refused to vanish completely. I realized that the conflict within me, love versus hatred, compassion versus fury, would only grow more intense. Something would have to give, and soon. The turning point arrived on a damp, gray afternoon. Rain drummed on the windows, echoing the pounding in my head. Lynn was due at the hospital for her rescheduled chemo, but instead of driving her there, I found myself gripping the steering wheel and heading to Dr. Carter's house. Lynn sat in the passenger seat, eyes hollow, arms folded. She barely questioned my decision. Maybe she sensed the unstoppable momentum of my wrath. We pulled up in front of his neat single-story home. A neat lawn, a few potted plants on the porch. A place that spoke of quiet respectability. I slammed the car door and marched up to the entrance, not bothering to knock softly. I hammered my fist against the door, adrenaline surging. Lynn stood behind me, pale and trembling. When the door opened, Dr. Carter stared at me with a resigned expression, as though he'd been expecting this. Maybe he had. He glanced over my shoulder at Lynn. She avoided his gaze. Without a word, he stepped aside, letting us in. The living room was tidy, tastefully decorated, a comfortable sofa facing a large TV. Medical books lined a shelf. A half-filled mug of coffee sat on the coffee table. "You knew I'd come," I said in a low growl. "You've been waiting for the fallout." He closed the door. "Yes," he replied simply. "I'm not running." "Good." My voice shook. "Because we have a lot to settle." Lynn crossed her arms, shivering. Dr. Carter gestured for her to sit, but she recoiled. I moved deeper into the room, my anger radiating. Outside, the rain intensified, rattling against the windows. "You want me to apologize again?" Dr. Carter said, his tone resigned. "Or do you want me to beg forgiveness? I've done enough damage. You both deserve better." I let out a harsh laugh. "Forgiveness? That's not what I'm here for." I yanked my phone from my pocket, flicking through the images I'd stored. "I have pictures, texts, proof that you exploited a patient under your care." He stiffened, eyes flashing. "Exploited? That's a strong word." I advanced toward him. "A word that the medical board will understand. I can destroy your career." Lynn gasped behind me, stepping forward. "Tom, please." I whirled on her, my frustration boiling over. "What? You want me to spare him? After what you two did behind my back?" My voice cracked. The anguish in my chest felt like a physical wound. "Have you considered how humiliating this is for me? For our family?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She blinked back tears, hugging herself as though trying to hold her frail body together. Dr. Carter exhaled shakily. "If you want to report me, I won't fight it. I deserve the consequences." "Damn right you do," I snarled. My pulse thundered in my ears. For a split second, I imagined punching him, letting my rage manifest physically. The tension in my fists ached for release. Lynn's voice was faint but firm. "Tom, maybe we should leave." I ignored her, glaring at Dr. Carter. "I'm not just going to the medical board. I'm going to the hospital administration, the local news outlets, anyone who will listen. You'll never work in this town again." A spasm of panic flickered across his face. "You have every right. But let's not pretend you're doing this solely for justice. You want revenge." "You're damned right I do," I spat. My words seemed to echo off the walls. "You took advantage of my wife. And you, Lynn, you broke everything we had." My voice cracked with a raw edge. "I stood by you. And now I'm expected to just what? Accept it." I turned away, pacing in agitation. Lynn's ragged breaths behind me tore at the edges of my fury. A part of me screamed that she was still the woman I'd cherished all these years, the woman whose life was now threatened by cancer. But the betrayal overshadowed all else. She spoke at last, voice shaking. "Tom, I know I don't deserve your mercy. But please, Anthony was there for me in ways you couldn't be. I don't mean that as an excuse. It's just the truth. I felt like I was drowning, and he pulled me to the surface. I glared at her, struggling against a surge of complicated emotions. The cruelty of it struck me. I tried so hard to keep her afloat, yet she found her solace with someone else. "Tom," Dr. Carter said, voice taut with resignation, "if you want to tear down my career, do it. But don't do it at Lynn's expense. She doesn't need more stress. She needs to focus on her health." I wheeled on him, anger blazing. "You dare talk about her health after what you've done? She might not live to see another year, and you fill her final months with secrets." My voice rose to a shout, and I saw fear in Lynn's eyes. The wind outside battered the windows. For a fleeting second, I remembered how I used to cradle Lynn after her chemo, reminding her she was strong enough to keep going. Now all I wanted was to punish them both. I felt something snap inside me. I turned to Lynn. "Get in the car. Now." She hesitated, then nodded weakly, stepping outside into the rain. I pivoted back to Dr. Carter. My tone came out cold, measured. "I'm going to do what I have to. You'll hear from me soon." Then I strode out, slamming the door behind me. Driving away from his house, I could feel the storm inside me, wilder than the one raging in the sky. Lynn clutched her seat, trembling, her breath coming in shallow gulps. She didn't speak. Neither did I. The air felt suffocating. Halfway home, I pulled over in an empty parking lot, headlights cutting through the downpour. Lynn looked at me, fear etched into her gaunt features. "Tom," she whispered. I shut my eyes. "I can't keep doing this, Lynn. The lies, the images in my head, it's killing me." She reached out to touch my shoulder. I flinched away, but not as forcefully as before. "What do you want?" she asked, voice hushed. The question lingered in the air, its weight heavy. "I want justice," I said, teeth gritted. "And I want out." Her eyes widened with understanding. "Out? As in divorce," I said, the word cutting my tongue like broken glass. "I can't stay. Not after what you've done." Her breath caught, tears sliding down her cheeks. She seemed too stunned to respond, and maybe too ill to fight me on it. "But my treatments, your insurance, your support." My voice grew hoarse. "I've given you everything for 4 decades. Now I give you this final mercy. I'll cover the medical bills as long as you need. But us, we're finished." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing, while thunder rumbled overhead. I stared out the windshield, heart pounding. A part of me wanted to take it all back, to hold her close and pretend the betrayal never happened. But the rage and hurt overshadowed any impulse of compassion. My mind buzzed with revenge fantasies. How I'd publicly expose Carter, how I'd ensure Lynn never forgot the damage she caused. Yet another voice inside whispered, "She's dying. Is this truly what you want her final days to be?" I turned the key, and we drove the rest of the way home in silence. Rain blurred the streetlights into watery halos. My chest felt hollow, as though some essential piece of me had been torn out. When we reached the house, I parked and said quietly, "Pack your essentials. I'm dropping you at a motel near the hospital tomorrow. I need you out of this house." She trembled. "Tom, I'm so sick. Please, I can't." "Figure it out," I interrupted coldly. "Or call him. I don't care." My voice was flat, as if I'd used up all my fury and only numb resolve remained. She swallowed hard, tears mingling with the raindrops on her face. I got out without another word, leaving her in the car for a moment. The storm whipped at me, stinging raindrops on my skin. This was my choice, to cast out the woman I once believed I'd love forever. Inside the house, everything felt eerily the same. The lamp glowed in the foyer, the clock ticked softly. But I knew the truth, the life we built had crumbled. I didn't sleep that night. I rummaged through old photo albums, tears burning my eyes. Pages of memories, beach vacations, Christmas dinners, the day we bought the house, Lynn beaming as she hung a "Home Sweet Home" sign, all overshadowed by the searing knowledge of her betrayal. I wondered if my vengeance might be too cruel, too final. But each time I pictured her in Carter's arms, the anger reignited. At dawn, I typed out an email to the hospital board, attaching the incriminating evidence. Text messages, times and dates, and photos. I wrote a blunt statement outlining Dr. Carter's unethical behavior with a terminally ill patient, citing relevant medical ethics codes. My hand hovered over the send button, my heart thundering. This would likely end his career, or at least smear it beyond repair. My finger clicked the mouse. The email was gone. No turning back. Next, I searched for local divorce attorneys, found a reputable one, and left a voicemail about scheduling an urgent consultation. My words felt mechanical, as though someone else were speaking. A strange numbness settled over me. Then I shut the computer, stepping away from the desk. The first step of my plan was in motion. Downstairs, I found Lynn sitting on the couch, a small suitcase at her feet. She looked pale as chalk, exhaustion deepening the lines on her face. When our eyes met, she offered a tentative, apologetic half-smile. "I'm ready to go," she said softly. I nodded, unable to muster any gentleness. "I'll drop you off at the motel near the hospital. You can keep your next chemo appointment. I'll pay for the room." She swallowed, tears glistening. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm sorry it came to this." I felt a pang of old affection, quickly drowned by bitterness. "Me too," I said and walked out the door, leaving her to follow. I placed her suitcase in the trunk, opened the passenger door. She climbed in, her movements slow and shaky. I started the car, and we pulled away from what had been our shared home for more than 2 decades. At the motel, a drab, budget place near the highway, I parked under a flickering neon sign. My stomach churned with a mix of guilt and grim satisfaction. I helped her check in, ignoring the curious glance from the receptionist. Lynn looked too sickly to hide her condition. We rode the creaky elevator up to the 2nd floor, reached the door, and went inside. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener. I set her suitcase down. "I'll send money for whatever you need," I said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "But I can't be here." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "Tom, I'm truly sorry." I turned away, tears threatening to spill. "I love you," I said, my voice trembling. I never stopped. Then, in a hollow tone, I whispered, "Goodbye, Lynn." I left without looking back, stepping into the dreary hallway. My heart hammered, each beat echoing the finality of my words. By the time I reached the car, my hands were shaking. I gripped the steering wheel to steady myself. She was alone in that dingy room, ill and frightened, but I couldn't shoulder her betrayal anymore. Back home, the silence was suffocating. The living room felt cavernous, stripped of its sense of belonging. I paced around, mind churning with all that had happened. I'd unleashed my wrath, severed my marriage, and set in motion the ruin of Dr. Carter's career. An empty satisfaction warred with regret. The phone rang. Unknown number. I considered ignoring it, but something made me pick up. "Tom Baker," a voice asked. "This is Linda Warren from the St. Francis Hospital Ethics Board. We received your email and the attachments. We'd like to schedule a formal review. The allegations are serious." I exhaled, my jaw tight. "Yes, I'm available," I replied, realizing my voice sounded hollow. We arranged a date and time. She hung up. I closed my eyes, the house around me so quiet I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock. My revenge was now official, unstoppable. The following day, I met my divorce attorney, a lean, sharp-eyed woman named Meredith. She listened to my story with professional detachment, nodding occasionally, scribbling notes. 41 years of marriage, she said. Will file under irreconcilable differences, possibly citing adultery. You have proof. I swallowed hard, sliding a few photos across her desk. She winced. Yes, that certainly. definitive. We'll begin the paperwork immediately. Do you have any property disputes? No, I mumbled. She can keep whatever she wants. I just want out. Meredith nodded. You're certain this is what you want? I hesitated. A flash of Lynn's tear-streaked face sprang to mind. I gritted my teeth, recalling the images of her entwined with Carter. Yes, I said, forcing confidence into my voice. I'm done. 2 weeks later, everything accelerated. The hospital board called me in for an official meeting. I sat at a large conference table with a handful of administrators. They asked me to describe the evidence, the timeline, how I discovered it. My voice shook at times, anger and humiliation lacing every word. They listened, grave and impassive. The affair between Dr. Carter and Lynn was undeniably unethical, especially given her stage 4 diagnosis. I walked out of there feeling both vindicated and nauseous. My phone buzzed. An unknown text. I opened it, seeing a message from Dr. Carter's number. I've resigned from the hospital. The board recommended it before the official hearing. I know you hate me, but please remember Lynn's condition. She needs care. Good luck, Tom. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. So he'd lost his position, or walked away to avoid a more public scandal. A piece of me felt triumphant. Another part felt empty. This was it, the full measure of my vengeance. I had destroyed the man's livelihood. Now he'd likely have to relocate or rebuild his career from scratch. As for Lynn, her only lifeline to specialized treatment had just become more complicated. That evening, I found myself alone in the house, the steady drone of the TV doing little to ease the hollow ache in my chest. I flipped through channels aimlessly. My phone lay silent on the table. No calls or messages from Lynn. My rage had consumed me for weeks, but now the adrenaline was gone, replaced by a strange hollowness. I grabbed my jacket, stepped outside onto the porch. The sky was clear, stars faint in the city glow. The rosebush by the window drooped even more, petals browning on the edges. I considered letting them wither away, an echo of my marriage. Yet a small memory tugged at me. How Lynn once spent an entire afternoon pruning that bush, humming a quiet tune. It struck me then. Everything was undone, irreversibly. I had my revenge, but at what cost? My wife was alone in a motel, her health in jeopardy. The house felt like a mausoleum of old memories. Even the man I despised, Dr. Carter, was no longer practicing, which might hurt other patients in need of his skill. But that was the path I'd chosen. No turning back. In the weeks that followed, the divorce proceedings moved swiftly. Lynn didn't contest anything. She accepted my terms with a weary resignation. Our son, Brian, finally heard pieces of the story, enough to know that I was leaving Lynn. He called me, outraged, demanding explanations. I fed him some sanitized version of events. He hung up, furious. It seemed I'd lost more than a wife. I'd alienated my son, who lived too far away to see the situation for himself. By the time the court date arrived, I felt like a husk. Lynn showed up looking pale, thinner than ever. We didn't speak. The judge granted a summary dissolution, finalizing the end of our 41-year marriage. When the gavel struck, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Relief, despair, guilt. Outside the courthouse, Lynn tried to meet my eyes, but I looked away, my heart too heavy. I drove home alone, the ring on my finger feeling like a cruel joke. I pulled into the driveway, stared at the rosebush. For a moment, I considered tearing it out of the ground. But I didn't. Instead, I forced myself inside, locked the door, and sank onto the sofa. A wave of realization broke over me. Nothing would ever be the same. I'd claimed my vengeance, but it hadn't fixed my heart. Lynn's betrayal still haunted me. The memory of her smile, her warmth, the fleeting sense of peace we once shared, all overshadowed by that single monstrous act of cheating and my equally monstrous act of revenge. And yet, as the sun set behind the suburban rooftops, a strange clarity emerged. I was free, in some sense, to rebuild what remained of my life. No illusions about love or marriage. No illusions about forgiveness. Just the raw knowledge that people, myself included, can be both devoted and destructive. I rose from the sofa, walked to the kitchen window, and stared at the wilted roses in the fading light. I thought of the future, of lonely evenings, phone calls from Brian that might never come, of regrets that would gnaw at me like an open sore, but I'd made my choice. Lynn had made hers. We'd reached the end. In that silent conclusion, I felt a quiet sense of finality. I might never fully heal from this betrayal. I might never forgive her, or myself, for how savagely things ended. But at least there was no more hiding, no more illusions. I let the ring slide off my finger, placed it on the counter. A single tear slid down my cheek, but I wiped it away, inhaling the shaky breath. Outside, a street lamp flickered, and the night stretched out endless and dark. This was my new reality. Empty house, empty heart, a mind full of memories. I felt certain I wouldn't find solace anytime soon. But maybe one day I'd learn to live with the ruins I created. And maybe that was all I could manage. I closed my eyes, hearing only the ticking clock and the hush of my own breath. The final page turned, and my old life ended. The rest would be a battle against regret and time. Battles I would face alone, with no illusions left to guide me.